my title is like this. My title image is like this. That though we have different kind of tones, finally we stand together, and that is called the cooperation. We understand each other. We appreciate the existence of each other. That is called the sense of cooperation. And that's why with having different tones, with different spirits, with different manifestations, we can stand together. And he says tomorrow there is no law. Means the society will be civilized to an extent that there will not be any kind of requirement of law, because there will not be any kind of disputes. So there will be a purely coherent kind of a society, and there will be a self-motivational force settling the disputes, requiring no presence of the law at all. So this is what he has, given us a message. And if you remember the Marxist conclusion of his entire ideology, what Marx aimed at in those days, he stated in a different phraseology. He stated, state wither away, means there will not be any kind of requirement of the state. So it will be a self-governed society. And that was the final goal of Karl Marx. So we need to appreciate him in a proper context. And Vivekananda has also said the same thing. Here in India, we cherish today Ramarajya. Why? Because in Ramarajya, there was no intervention into the day-to-day public life of the state. And that's why we cherish Ramarajya even today. It is not only that Rama was a great king, but the people of his state, they were also highly civilized. And that's why there was no intervention of the state needed into the day-to-day life. And that's why we want to see the day, that is tomorrow, where there is no requirement of the law. And that is how, in this context, we shall be appreciating whatever discussion today we shall be making. Yes, sorry. So let us understand, the first phrase, riparian. How from this phrase, our riparian rights have come into being, but we need to appreciate the etymology of the riparian words. Actually, there are two distinct roots from which this word has emanated. The one root is actually the Latin riparius, that is the river bank. Those who are settled on the shores of the bank, they are called the riparians. The word, that is the root from which this phrase has emanated, is exactly opposite to the first meaning. That is, that has come from the root pi. Pi means share. When we ask a question, what is the farmer's pie in this cooperative society? Means what is the share of individual farmer or the member of this society into this water user association? From that, a root that has come is re, means to scratch or tear or to cut. And from this root, another word, that is rift in the Danish language, has come into existence, which means bridge. And in the Middle High German, it is the Riff, that is the river bank or the seashore, which is very prominently meeting the first root. But here the second root, let us focus on. Rift, cut, tear means when the river traverses a particular path, you have seen the phenomenon because of the impact and velocity of the water, that it cuts the rock or the plain and it designates its own course, what is known as river gorge. So it cuts into, and that's why we call the eripia in the Greek, means the ruin. It ruins to some extent, but in a designed manner, and that is how the gorge is formed. But at the same point of time, we should understand that riparian means colliding with each other, means rifting, dividing. So here I think the more prominent understanding with the riparian has been with the second root. When we are practicing the riparian phrase today, that those who are sharing the same water bank, but whose interest are at the loggerheads. But we need to understand that we need to make a journey from the second to the first route. That is, we are sharing the same shore of the river bank. That is our aim. Because now we are civilized and we should travel from the second route is a genesis to the first route of genesis to rightly practice into our day-to-day life. With this context, today the sharing of water has become a conflict management, and that requires cooperation as the basis of solution. Actually, we need to appreciate the rights of others because it is necessary for the coexistence and also for the purpose of rejecting the bloodshed. It is inevitably required. Because the civilizational values have developed now and the human values have also developed, they are required to build now, replacing the brutal attitudes of the feudal era. And that is how we can better share the water, we can better utilize the water, we can shortly converge to the usable stage of the water. All otherwise, what today is happening, all the states, they are entering into a futile skirmish, simply wasting their time. Politicians deriving their best benefits to grab the political power for a decade or so, and then they wither away. They evanesce from the political scenario. Some other set of politicians take over their place, and finally they also play the dirty politics. It is the society which at the end of the day suffers by deprivation of the water, which is nobody's concern. But because we, the society, are direct victims of this, we need to understand that instead of simply entering into skirmish, we should take a wise stand and we should learn how to share the water without wasting the time, so that earliest could be the derivation of the benefits of the water. That should be our stand, and that's why all this cerebral exercise that we are going to wade through. I'm going to take you through these points in this session. What is the international law? How is international law created? Enforcement of the international law, hierarchy in the international law, scope of the international water law, and linking international water law and domestic water law. Albeit that today's discussion will be having a large encompassment, and that's why the depth will not be too much. But there will be a cursory understanding, at least primary understanding of all these aspects, so that we can better appreciate my session number 2 and 3, in which I shall be taking you on a focused discussion with a greater depth. Actually, international law or your domestic law, the fundamental is very specific. What do we mean by the law? When people entrust the power of making decision to govern the generic or general control of the society, and when they exercise their power and they accept some set of rules or set of principles as an official code of practice by the society, we call it a law. And when they gather, either in the form of an assembly or a parliament or a senate, and they endorse this, either by majority or by unanimity, that becomes an imposition upon the target society. And that we call the law. At the international level, because there is no single assembly to control the entire universe, there is no single parliament or no single senate to control over the universe, the nation states, here the word mind well, it is the nation states and not the states. Each nation is considered as a state, as a unit of governance. And that's why the phrase used here is the nation states. So when they all meet together and they accept certain set of rules that govern the conduct and relations of the member states of that assembly or senate or parliament, or a convention that serves as a framework for the conduct for them and a mechanism for encouraging a stability and consistency amongst all the nations' behavior who are into that group, then it becomes an international law. So this is how the same principle of enactment of the law is applied over here by formation of a common body. And in the international law, there are some lines of differentiation between the domestic law and the international law, how they differ from each other. Number one, the key actors are the units which we call the nation state in the international law, and they are bound by the rights and obligations emerging out of their union or assembly or convention. Whereas in the domestic law, the real players upon whom the imposition of the law is made, they are either the private citizens or the business entities within that particular nation state. So here in the domestic law, molecular unit is individual citizen or a business enterprise. Whereas at the international law, the molecular unit is a nation state. So this is the most important difference between the two. Difference number two, that so long as the judiciary is concerned, the judiciary is appointed under the domestic law by that nation state whose scope is within the territory or boundary of that unit state. Whereas here the judicial body that has been appointed for this limited purpose by all the member countries of this association or an assembly or a convention, that judiciary has a very wide jurisdiction that spreads amongst all the member countries, means summing up all the boundaries of the nation states will be their jurisdiction. But yes, jurisdiction will be limited to this particular subject on which they have agreed to enact certain laws. So depth point of view, the scope is very narrow, but encompassment point of view, the scope is very wide with the international judicial systems. Whereas for the domestic courts, the jurisdiction from territory point of view or geography point of view is limited, but the grip on this society is so immense that the entire public life is directly affected by the behavior of the judiciary. Whereas there, the judiciary's direct impact on the social behavior is minimal. So this is difference number two. And now finally, there is one difference, that all the international laws are based on negotiated agreements. Means all the nation states have assembled together and they have negotiated certain agreements and put their signs over it. So this negotiated agreement is like a contract. And that's why this international law is basically emerging from the basic concepts of the contract. Whereas all the domestic laws, they are not actually emanated from the basic concept of contract because they are not negotiated agreements. So this is the most important difference number three. With this preliminary understanding, we shall go ahead to the next slide, that is how international law is created. Actually, as I told you, it is formed through the mutual consent of the nation states. You may cite the examples of the BRICS countries, of the ASEAN countries, the G8, or so. For a limited purpose, they have decided to follow certain sets of principles, and they have given a name like BRICS or G8 or ASEAN or whatsoever it is. And that's why it is a product of mutual consent. Now let us understand there are two different forms that can create the international law. One is the codified international law, and the other form is the customary international law. Actually, codified international law means the member countries of that particular group, they have assembled, they have consented a particular agreement, and they have put their signatures and seal over it, and a written code, a legally binding instrument that has come into existence. Actually speaking, it's a treaty amongst all the countries, but because the code of practice is also sealed by all the countries, it is called a codified international law. And the other one is a customary international law. So this is one method of creating international law. The other method is the customary international law. That refers to international commitments arising from established state practices rather than written obligations. Like nowadays, you might be aware of the likelihood of abuse of the nuclear power. So here that has been a customary practice that all the countries make a diplomatic statement at international level that though they are having some enemy countries, they won't be using first the nuclear weapon. And those who announce that they won't use the nuclear weapon first, they are called non-proliferating countries. Now with this non-proliferation kind of an idea, there are two different versions. A few countries who have signed non-proliferation treaty, they have a codified international law within NPT countries. Means those who have signed the NPT. And some who have simply announced that they won't first use the nuclear weapons, they have on their own agreed to follow that treaty without making a written signature or a seal on it. So that is a customary kind of a practice, customary international law. Like when there is a war going on and some countries' army marches with white flag in the hands and no weapons with them, the other country has to take a notice that they are now coming forward for a negotiation or for a peace treaty. So this is a customary practice, and this is not today's practice. This is prevalent in the world for last several centuries. So this is called customary international law. So custom can also create international law like this. So this is called generally accepted social behavior of the nations. Two other sources of international laws are also there. One is called the general principles of law, that is called fundamentals of jurisprudence, and the other source is the subsidiary source, that is called case law or the precedents. So with this understanding how the international laws are created, let us go as to how they are enforced in the practice. they are operated very differently from the domestic legal systems, as I told you in the beginning. Enforcement does not occur through an executive branch of the government. Here in India, because we have accepted that judiciary, executive, and legislative are three exclusive, mutually exclusive, and independent wings of the country. Here, for us, the distinction between executive and judiciary is very clear, it is very thick. But here, in the general practice, when we say that enforcement does not occur through an executive branch of the government, means that includes judiciary as well. So the execution or enforcement is not done either by executive or the judiciary of a particular country, but enforcement is to be done by the respective governments and the international court or tribunal that they have accepted to rule over or to preside over or to adjudicate over. Now let us understand the functions. As a consent based, what these functions are. Enforcement is achieved through collective actions. Like you might be knowing that United Nations sends the UN army for the purpose of peacemaking into some infested countries, infested by violation. How this happened? United Nations army is not a particular country's army. There are so many countries, army men into the United Nations army. And that combined army, a conglomerated army, goes for a peace mission into a particular country. How it happens? Because it is taken as a collective action. It is a collective action. The same way, states are more likely to abide by an agreement or negotiate a resolution to receive the same treatment. All the member countries are to receive the same treatment. And that's why it is not the responsibility of a particular state to encapsulate their interest. It is the responsibility of all the member states to honor the interest of any of the states. So it is a sense of collective responsibility that emerges out of such treaties or agreement. And that is how the enforcement is done collectively. International Court of Justice and International Court of Arbitration, they are very good examples for the permanent establishments to adjudicate over that. But the members or the members nation states who have accepted the jurisdiction of this International Court of Arbitration and International Court of Justice can avail the benefit of getting honored their interest. Those who are not members cannot just approach like this. So this is how the enforcement of the international law is done. It is very tricky in a sense. In other sense, it is too simple as compared to the domestic law's execution. Now let us understand the hierarchy of the international law. Actually, the hierarchy is not very rigid over here. When I am saying hierarchy is not rigid, does not mean there is no importance of the hierarchical level. Importance is there, but still the hierarchy is flexible, and sometimes some hierarchical levels are conglomerated or they are mixed, and sometimes some hierarchical level may supersede the higher hierarchical level in the exceptional cases. And that's why I say that it is not a rigidly framed hierarchy. However, let us understand how the hierarchy in the international law is maintained and it is followed. Number one, if it is a written treaty through some convention, that is given the utmost priority. That stands number one in the hierarchy. Most important, the supreme one is that. The next is the customary international law. When there is no written treaty or codified international law, the next priority is given to the customary international law. Then the third hierarchy comes in the form of generally accepted principles of law, which I called fundamentals of jurisprudence. And then the primary sources, when they are not actually workable, or they are only partly workable, then the previous judicial decisions or the case laws or the opinions of highly qualified scholars into those domains, they are considered as the subsidiary sources of international law. And here, the hierarchy is not absolute. In some cases, the hierarchy is allowed to be superseded by the lower important nodes of the hierarchy. In the discussion of actual international experiences, I shall highlight some of these aspects. Now let us understand the scope of the international water law. Now I am focusing on the water law. Earlier it was the international law, but now we are gradually making a transition towards the international water law. It is generally applicable to the freshwater resources. It does not apply to the marine or oceanic water. Or I would say there is a separate body of law for the maritime law. And that's why here when I use the international water law, the marine law is exclusive to it. The law of the seas is also exclusive to it. And the definition of the water course is also very specifically given by the United Nations 1997 Convention, which was focused on non-navigational uses of international water courses. And they have defined the water course as a system of surface waters and groundwaters constituting by virtue of their physical relationship a unitary whole and normally flowing into a common terminus. So this is defined as an international water course, and we shall be focusing our international water law into this limited perspective so as to focus the discussion. Now, just an overview as to how the international water law is linked with the domestic water law or the national water law in our Indian perspective. Actually, international water law encompasses the accepted set of rules which govern the relationship among sovereign nations over freshwater resources. But basically, these laws have in their own foundation the fundamentals of jurisprudence and some basic principles of resource sharing, that is the natural resource sharing. But here, because water is somewhat different from other natural resources, as it is a flowing resource, coal or your iron ore or your manganese ore, they are not flowing resources, and that's why they can be defined in terms of some boundaries, say the political boundaries or geographical boundaries. But here, because water is a flowing resource, its sharing cannot be simply compared with the sharing of other resources. And that's why the principles of water sharing at international level, which are accepted in the form of international water law, they are quite distinct from other other resource sharing. So domestic water law, maybe it is pertaining to India, or it is pertaining to Philippines, or it is pertaining to Singapore, or it is pertaining to USA, but they have honored the fundamentals of jurisprudence, which are the very foundation of international water law, with proper reverberation into their codified laws. Suppose in India, several judgments have come to the surface, they are delivered by the Supreme Courts in course of time under the Article 21 of the Constitution, that is right to life. But under the right to life, so much of delineation has now been done by the Supreme Court that you will be astonished that, just one simple phrase, right to life, what kind of ramifications could be there with it. But Supreme Court has very logically delineated all these things. And so many principles, they have now become the basis of adjudication made by several river boards and several dispute tribunals. So we shall go through them one by one at the international level this time and at the state level in my subsequent lectures, lecture number 2 and 3. So let us go into that, but fundamental principles of international water law and domestic water law remain the same. Only minor modifications are made, but they are all the case-specific modifications. They are context-based modification rather than the logical modifications. Now let us understand the hydropolitics and water diplomacy, what they are and why they are needed. As I told you, now we have come out of the feudal stage of the time. Now that phase has been almost over. And now we are into the diplomatic stage wherein negotiations are more important than the muscle power. So the water resources fluctuate widely in space and time, as I told you, because it is a flowing resource. Its management is usually fragmented and it is often subject to vague or arcane and sometimes even the contradictory legal principles are applied to a particular case, and that's why some existence of hydropolitics. And let us take one note of an important aspect of the democratic life. Because there is democracy, there is politics. Even when there was no democracy, there was politics. But the type of politics has now changed. In the democracy, the politics is coupled with diplomacy, whereas in the feudal days, the politics was majorly coupled with the physical power. Diplomacy was also there, but there was in a modicum extent, whereas today diplomacy has become more important. So its importance in the democratic setup, when every domain of the public life has been completely politicized, water is also not free from that. And that's why it is hydropolitics and water diplomacy. And we, being the water professionals, must understand what is the hydropolitics and how to become water diplomats. That is our responsibility. We are the advocates of the water, for the water, and we have to live by water. And that's why this is the most important topic for us to understand. All water management is multi-objective and is based on managing competing interests of different parts of the society. The values are also competing and the demands are also competing. Adding to that, international or state level boundaries, which are the political and geographical boundaries, they add to the complexities. And without careful recrafting of these issues, the chances of finding acceptable solutions decrease exponentially. And this has been the classical history of the feudal world. Even in the recent days, some of the river boards adjudications or even the tribunals adjudications, which are not fully honored by the states within India, and this is a product of these kind of issues, that recrafting of issue that was not properly done, and the involvement of the state that was also willy-nilly. Surface and groundwater that cross international boundaries or interstate boundaries and they also add to the challenges. While the potential for paralyzing disputes is essentially too high, we have been experiencing. History shows that water can catalyze dialogue and cooperation, even between especially contentious riparians. So, what I mean to say here, that the risk is also understood to us, and that's why water diplomacy is more important over here. Hydropolitics is also there, but it is our responsibility to ensure that hydropolitics do not go beyond a certain level, especially from endangering the social existence point of view. Now, let us, go through this fundamental maxim. I shall be citing in between certain adages and maxims so as to provide the context of a particular case study. Evolution of principles from recognition of other sovereignty and equity as essentials for sharing water. And this is what I mean by sense of cooperation into the water sector. Let us first understand the doctrine of absolute territorial sovereignty, which becomes always upstream centric. Actually, it is the upstream states who are free to divert all the water without considering the need of the downstream state is called the absolute territorial sovereignty. Means the country's absolute sovereignty permits even tapping water passing through its boundary or its territory without any kind of limits, without any kind of care for any other states who are sharing the same river basin is called doctrine of absolute territorial sovereignty. Means the territorial sovereignty inevitably incorporates the right to tap the water of international or interstate basin is the basic spirit of this principle, and that is also called Harmon Doctrine, named after US Attorney General Mr. Harmon, who propounded this principle. I am taking you, or rather I shall be providing you a bird's eye view of the entire labyrinthine history of this principle, how the Mexico and USA had conflicting interest, and how the addressal of the same was arrived at after a very long struggle. Nowadays, this principle has got a little support and it is almost vanished from the practice, and the international law does not represent or endorse this principle at all. But historically, we need to understand, because the very seed of the conflict, that is dominance of the second root of the riparian, how that took over the entire scene, and how the arguments continued for long years, and then people attained the wisdom and they came to terms. This entire history is very interesting, so I shall be taking you to a brief introduction to this history, overview of the history. Actually, you know the Rio Grande River that origins somewhere in the Mexico, and then it flows down, forms a boundary between the Mexico and the USA. I'm showing you the map in the subsequent slide. But there was some treaty that was entered into by both the countries, that is Mexico and America, in 1848, and that was meant actually for the navigational purpose. There were so many misunderstandings between the ships of Mexico and USA. Even some other countries' ships supplying some goods to Mexico or USA passing through the neighboring country, they were subject to some kind of suspicions, and they were scrutinized very rigorously, and there were so many legal issues, and the trade was being affected. So they entered into a treaty for the purpose of navigation and free use of the river as a boundary. Then, citing the same treaty, because there was conflicting demand, the USA's Texas state, they started drawing more water. The river became almost dry in the upstream in the Mexico portion, and that's why their minister in 1890 wrote a note to the Department of War in the USA that their riparian rights were being violated. So this is how first, the riparian term came into exchange of legal notes. And a dry river bed for 500 miles, so it was almost drying up of the river, that was shown the concern on by the Minister of Mexico, and that was officially taken to the US government. Here I am showing you the map, and I am annotating the boundary, then yes, so this is the river course. This is the river course. Sorry, this is how. And this is the main Rio Grande. And this goes into the Colorado state. So actually speaking, the New Mexico and Colorado, both were drawing water. But the quantity was so big that here in the Mexico portion, here, this is the Mexico state. Here the initial state, this initial state, that was dried up. And that's why they're concerned. Now let us come to the logical point. Actually, the US government's response was, very serious. We can't say that they were the sleeping ducks. They reflected very seriously. And US Congress passed a concurrent resolution concerning the problem, acknowledged that the upstream diversion from the Rio Grande were depriving this portion of the Mexico, and US Department of the State, they did not have in those days any in-house legal advisor, so they referred it to the Department of Justice, and that was headed in those days by Attorney General Mr. Harman, who took the entire issue in a very different way. He propagated that USA was a sovereign country, and in the sovereign country, I'm mending my one mistake. This Colorado River that is emanating from the USA and going down to the Mexico, I'm sorry for the mistake. Actually the argument that was laid by Mr. Harman as Attorney General, that it was questioning sovereignty of the USA. So, entirely a different kind of a twist was given by Mr. Harman. And the matter went to the Supreme Court. Once the US Congress passed a resolution, and the Attorney General was differing from it, the matter went to the Supreme Court. But Supreme Court did not agree with the Harman's theory. Supreme Court took a different stand. Supreme Court said that whatever the arguments of Harman is, that sovereignty of a nation and everything, but sovereignty is applicable for all those dealings which are limited to the boundaries of a sovereign country. But the river is not merely the boundary of a sovereign country called USA. River is a boundary of the Mexico as well, and that's why it is a shared boundary. Number two, because water is flowing and it is not limited to be within the boundary of the USA as a sovereign country. A sovereign country called USA cannot have an exclusive right on that water. So Supreme Court took a very sensible stand in those days, and the minister of the USA saw that in the court the matter was prolonging too long, so he suggested to appoint one international boundary commission, and that was jointly entrusted the responsibility of sorting out the issues by the USA and Mexico in 1889. See the wisdom of the people in those days. We need to learn from those days. And why we call USA the great country? Because the fundamentals of jurisprudence were gifted by them in those days. And that too against their attorney general. It is not so simple a thing. It is too big a thing. Going against the opinion of the attorney general and setting aside his opinion completely and coming out with a very humane and fundamentally strong proposition endorsing the coexistence of both the countries, that was not a simple leap towards a new milestone. And in 1889, this commission was endorsed. In 1944, a water treaty was defined by the United Nations and the United States and the Mexico, and the broad context are like this. I'm not reading them out because I'm going to share with you this presentation on the email. Now I am coming to exactly opposite kind of a principle, that is downstream riparians' rights to be considered, setting aside the importance of the upstream states' rights, completely against what Dr. Herman propounded. This is called absolute territorial integrity theory. It was, earlier was called absolute territorial sovereignty. This is territorial integrity. But this says that river is a common property of all the co-riparians, and no state is allowed to deprive other states of the benefits of waters in question. Apparently looking, this first statement is not objectionable. This is not objectionable. But let us come down. Lower riparian has the right to claim the continued and uninterrupted flow of water from the upper riparian territory, no matter whatsoever is the priority. This is now the objectionable. And that's why it is called downstream centric. This is also not supported by the modern commentators. Even it's not a part of the international water law today. Absolute territorial sovereignty and absolute territorial integrity, both were opposite to each other kind of legal concepts, competing with each other, completely against. That's why some kind of balanced approach was needed. Obviously, history is the witness of invention of the concepts, legal systems, administrative systems, and the social customs as well. So historically speaking, these two have been completely obsolete kind of principles, now not at all of any interest of anybody, but historically we need to learn them, how a balanced approach has come. First, the extreme duals, and then a balance between the two. So that is how the history has witnessed. So I thought I should give you a brief overview of. Now let us come to a reasonable balance between rights of upstream and downstream riparians. This theory of limited territorial sovereignty, this is called the balanced approach. The first statement of the previous approach, that is absolute territorial integrity has been interdigitated into this. Every state is free to use shared rivers flowing on its territory as long as utilization does not prejudice the rights and interests of co-riparians. This is a very balanced statement. Co-riparians have reciprocal rights and duties. Again, a very balanced statement. And they are entitled to avail equitable share and benefits. That is also a very balanced statement. This principle or doctrine has now been in wide acceptance. It is a part of the international law. The Mekong River Basin 1995 Agreement, the Sawa River Basin 2002 Framework Agreement, even the SADC South African Protocol in 1995, they are all actually founded fundamentally on this limited territorial sovereignty. I am taking you to a very small tangential reference to a Mekong River Commission. Actually, the Kingdom of Cambodia, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, the Kingdom of Thailand, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, they all had Mekong as a shared river basin. And they established a Mekong River Commission. However, the protocol to the agreement on the cooperation for the sustainable development of the Mekong River Basin for the establishment and commencement of this commission, the way was not that simple, because here I am showing you the map of the Mekong River. The path is like this, from the upper territory, from the upper territory, like this, the river flows down like this, and finally it comes over here in the Vietnam. Obviously, the interests were colliding. So, in this colliding interest, finally, the path was established by the lead of the tailender state, because obviously the tailender state is the most depriving state. So Vietnam took the lead. They approached the Cambodia and Thailand that because they are the tailenders and the river commission not working, they can't really avail the benefits of the river, and the upstream projects are coming up very fast. So finally, on the instance of Vietnam, that all come together, and instead of expeditiously taking up their projects in the upstream, they entrusted all the decisions to the Mekong River, saying that whatever water sharing treaty will be arrived at, finally according to the development of the projects, so long as water conservation or irrigation were concerned, would be taken up, and that is how the issue was sorted out. But obviously, here the approach that was considered as the basis of the treaty was the balanced approach, and the entire river sharing was very meticulously worked out in the Mekong agreement. But this is how the principle came into being. Soon in 1995, the South African countries also adopted the same principle, and even the Sawa River Basin Agreement was also made based thereupon. An SADC protocol, that is applicable to the South Africa. All the member countries of South Africa, they follow the same protocol that is founded on the same principle. But 1995 was a landmark year that saw this limited territorial sovereignty principle. And soon thereafter, in 1997, when the United Nations Convention met, they interdigitated this principle so nicely that in the subsequent principles, when we discuss, you will be seeing some kind of reflection of this principle into emergence of other principles as well. Utilizational value of water to be taken as the basis of sharing water means water not to be viewed as a commodity, or not the cost aspect of water to be considered as the basis of any treaty, but the utilizational value. Because water is a resource and not a commodity, it should not be viewed in terms of cost. It should not be evaluated in terms of cost, but its utilizational value should be taken as the basis of sharing of water. Now, one step ahead, not just the balance of the interest of the state, but now we are going into the finer dimensions of the water, that is considering value of water, that is the utilizational value of water. Now the jurisprudence is taking finer shape. This is called doctrine of equitable and reasonable utilization. That is use-oriented doctrine. It is a subset, as I told you in the beginning, it is a subset of the doctrine of limited territorial sovereignty. But still, this is a finer dimension, not only sharing the water resources on any other basis, but the utilizational values. And here, I always cite one example. When Sant Eknath was traveling for a pilgrimage, he was going to Rameshwar. And he had a pot of Gangajal, water of Ganges, because, in Indian religious tradition, it is of very high importance that you carry Gangajal and to offer to a Shivling. So Eknath was carrying with him a pot of water full with Gangajal, and he was going on foot towards Rameshwar. On the way, some region was encountered which was infested with a very severe drought. On the way, a donkey was on verge of death, and Eknath saw him. He approached him, and because of the thirst that the donkey was dying, he poured the entire water within his pot into the mouth of the donkey, and the donkey stood up. The people accompanying Saint Eknath, they asked him, "What did you do?" He said, "I see my God in this donkey as well." So the utilizational value of water, that is best understood by this example. And here, if we are associated with the water as a resource with utilizational values, I don't think there will be any kind of partisan or parochial idea into our mind that I shall be benefiting out of water by selling it. It is against the basic values of humanity. So this is the use-oriented doctrine, and in Helsinki Rules in 1966, even United Water Course Convention 1997, as I introduced you, they have all interdigitated this very nicely into their protocols. And this is how, this has now become a rule of the day. Now, some more finer development, or we can say, a finer shaping of the legal dimensions. Besides the rights of downstream riparian protection against any harm is important. Means not only the utilizational values, but ensuring that there is no harm to the downstream riparian. This is the Gandhian philosophy. What Mahatma Gandhi said, he used the phraseology in a very appealing tone. He said, Sagar Vrutta Samaj. What did he mean by Sagar Vrutta Samaj? He said that when there is a whirl occurring in an ocean or a water body, there is an outer periphery, then there is an inner circle of water eddy, then there is further inner circle, and then there is a concentric kind of a phenomena developing to form the core point. Just as the outermost circle takes care of the shape of the subsequent inner circle, which takes care of the subsequent inner circle, and finally the centric or the core small circle is taken care of. In the social model also, the same should be the principle to be adopted. The big brother, the man who is very rich, should take care of the next level of the people, means the higher upper class. The higher upper class should take care of the upper class. The upper class should take care of the higher middle class. The higher middle class to take care of the middle class, and the middle to take care of the poor. And that is how the benefits to be transported. And they should be transpired among different sections of the society. And that is how you can have a coherent society. Mahatma Gandhi wanted to say like this, and his principle is adopted into the water sector at international level in a different context, that insulating the downstream riparians from getting caused any harm. So this is how this principle came into being, that is obligation not to cause significant harm to any of the riparian. So this principle says that no states are allowed to use the water courses such that significant harm is caused to other basin states or basin nations or to their environment even, including harm to the human health. So even pollution should not be made by any country. That will be harming the health of people of some neighboring state or neighboring countries. I'm just citing one small example. In the earlier days, our relations with Pakistan were not really bitter. Rather, I would say, we could not forget that Pakistan was a part of this country. Nor Pakistani people could really accept in those days that they were also Indians once upon a time. In those days, in the East Pakistan, what we call Bangladesh today, they had, a Karnafuli River Dam to take off. But then the state of Assam, that was likely to be subjected to floodings, causing threat to the human lives in the downstream. And this issue was raised, and Pakistan, they dropped the project, sportingly admitting that they did not study the effect in the downstream portion. And that is how the project was put ashelf. So this is the principle called obligation not to cause significant harm. Now another principle, another finer dimension associated with the fundamentals of jurisprudence. Principle of perpetual right or prior apportionment. This is an ancient principle, but this is still somewhat accepted in the practice even today. This has a historical basis. Even in our general social behavior, this principle is very nicely interwoven. Sometimes we see that there is some kind of, a mela. In India, Kumbh Mela is also there. Then some festival mela is also there, like Janmashtami. There is some kind of mela. You know what the hawkers do? There is no permanent establishment of any hawker over there. So they come a day or two prior to the actual event. They establish a small tent over there. They spread their sheets of plastic or tarpaulins, and they demonstrate their products or the commodities over there, and then the customers go and they buy the product. And that is how, a temporary kind of a market comes into being. But these hawkers, they follow first come first rule. That is the historical basis rule. That who came there first, who spread his tarpaulin first, that much portion is his, and the next one, whosoever comes, will be taking adjoining portion or some other part of it. But he will not disturb the one who has first established his tent and a selling hawk. So this principle, in the practice, how it came into being. Actually, there was one very famous river called Nile that was shared by so many countries. By South Sudan, then Uganda, Ethiopia, then the Sudan, then Egypt. So many countries were sharing the same Nile, and Nile was really speaking the soul of all these countries. And that forms the boundary of all these countries. So this is how in the map I am showing you this river. Sorry. It is this river. Okay. It is this river path. It is this river. And other tributary is called the Blue Line. That emerges from Ethiopia. This is exclusively emerges from Ethiopia, and the white blue that emerges from Uganda. And this is how the states. So in 1995, this Sudan took a lead. There the water agreements, they were entered into 1959 under the Nile Waters Agreement, which were shared only by 3 countries. That should be reviewed. And the Ethiopian president in those days, he was inclined to resort to open threats of military action. As I told you, the feudal kind of a mindset. Then, realizing the potential for the conflict regarding Nile, Egypt, Ethiopia, and other states, as I told you, the wise people, the leaders, they came together. They decided to develop a Nile Basin Initiative in 1999. And in 2010, in very short a period, just a decade, NBI produced a cooperative framework agreement. That was albeit rejected by Egypt and Sudan both, because their interests were not sufficiently taken care of in this agreement. But still the draft agreement sorted out some fundamental issues, and only part issues of Egypt and Sudan, they were the balance. Actually, each of the treaty has a distinct history, and we need to deliberate very long on this. But because today our objective is to learn the doctrine, we are just having a citation of these historical developments rather than going into the details of this treaty. So their refusal to join the CFA, but still they persisted, the furtherance of the CAA. However, some issues got sorted out, some remained balanced, but still all the issues are not duly addressed and they are not sorted out, and the Nile water resources are still into a state of dispute. So what I mean to say that here, if the water is not wisely dealt with, it can take you to a loggerhead. If you wisely deal with it, it can become a cementitious element, and that can conjoin the societies, make a coherent society. It depends how you view the water, how you deal with the water. Now I am taking you to the India-Nepal Sarda Agreement, founded on the same principle. But that was a successful agreement. Here I have given you a agreement that could not finally got adopted into practice, whereas here I am citing one agreement that really came into being and it remained into currency for long years. This is the Sarda Agreement of the British India. In 1920, there was an exchange of letters between Nepal and British India that there should be a barrage in the Mahakali River. I'm not talking of Mahakali Treaty. It is exclusive treaty that came up much subsequently, long subsequently, and if time permits, we shall go into those details in some other session. But this is I'm calling of the Sarda Agreement. Mahakali River and a barrage to be constructed thereupon. Irrigation in India and some parts of Nepal was the main purpose. After 4 years, Nepal was to receive up to 1,000 cubic of flow from the barrage, and that too during the summer season, and 1,000 cubic Nepal was to receive, and 150 cubic during the winter season for the irrigation purpose. So there were two different seasons, non-winter 1,000 and winter 150. That is how. And the balance would be used by India. Nepal was able to make complete use of its own share long after. Only with the World Bank assistance they could complete their project in 1978. They took up in 71 and completed in 1997-98. So what I mean to say, the treaty went very fine. Nepal was given its share, but it could not harness the share. But still India honored the treaty. India never backed out of the treaty, saying that it was the British India and now we are a free India, so we are two separate countries. We never said like this. So this is, the India's gesture of respect to the sovereignty of the neighboring countries. Now, besides water resources, their benefits are the basis of sharing. I'm not talking of the values of the water. I'm talking of the benefits that are derived by the countries or states as the basis of sharing. In my second lecture, when I shall be discussing the Narmada Water Dispute Tribunal's award, I shall be discussing this aspect much in the details. This is called theory of equitable distribution of benefits. This is also very much in the vogue. In 1909, when the boundary water agreement between USA and Canada took place, and in 1964, the Columbia Treaty between the USA and Canada took place, they were having these fundamental ideas as the very foundation of the treaty. Here, there was an international joint commission appointed by both the countries together. More than 100 boundary water issues were addressed by IGC, and this is the world record. Some adjudication body or a forum has addressed some 12 issues, 15 issues, but this is the body which has adjudicated more than 100 boundary water issues so far, and it is still there. It is in existence. Now, the principle of consensus. When the cooperation is there is consensus. And when there is a consensus, there is no dispute. So there is not much to debate on this, but this is dynamic but consent-centric kind of a principle in which all the riparian states are entitled to use the water with prior notice, consultation, negotiation, as the case may be. And even the proposed project could also be taken up by the consensus of the riparian state. Nothing to discuss about this principle. It is accepted and it is taken as the foremost priority. If there is consensus, there is nothing kind of deliberation or dispute. It is simply, exchanging the greetings. Most of the treaties contain this principle nowadays. And that is the final product of the negotiation. This is the final product of the negotiation. As I told you, the IJC. What IJC was? It was actually based on mostly the consensus. But the consensus was arrived at by resorting to the principle of equitable benefits. That's why I have taken it into that slide instead of this slide. Now, this is the principle of transparent data sharing, that all the riparian states or nations, they not only will share the water, but they will also exchange their data transparently. And where there is transparency, there are no further disputes. If we maintain the transparency in the relationship is always long lasting. In 1944, USA-Mexico Water Treaty, as I told you earlier in the Harmon's theory, 1960s Indus Water Treaty, they all actually had this aspect into, that we shall be sharing all the data transparently to you. That is the stakeholding states or nations. And this transparency is the leitmotif of all the treaties. But here I want to clear that taxonomy that is followed by prioritization and combination of doctrines is the practice. What I mean by taxonomy? That no principle is the only principle of doctrine to help you arrive at a treaty. You need to understand all the principles together, put them in the right context for addressal of an appropriate issue in the appropriate context, and that is how all the doctrines and principles will together provide you a set of solutions. It is not that any of the principles is the panacea. That is, we need to understand. So we need to appreciate the appropriation as to how it is ensured in a particular situation, particular context, particular frame of the circumstances and issues. And these kind of, what you can say, your apt of applying the doctrine will help you better negotiate, better convince the people, and bringing all them to a single page. So a taxonomy is required to be followed by proper prioritization. How to apply which principle, where, when, why, by which method, in which context. All this, will be forming your acumen, and you will become better water diplomat. I'm, just giving you some historical overview of, one treaty that there was, Kashmir as a princely state, and there was one ruler. He had a water sharing treaty with the British government signed for the irrigation in 1870s. And that was that became the concerns for the Sindh and then Punjab. British government formed a judicial commission to resolve such conflicts, which was finally resolved through Rao Commission report in 1940. But that was not properly implemented due to creation of India and Pakistan in 1947. I am taking you to a very clumsy history. that in spite of being wise people on both the sides, culling out of the paltry issues was not possible. Because the situation sometimes, makes so clumsy an issue that nobody can sort it out. So here, because of the 1947 separation of Pakistan from India, the situation became more clumsy. Then I'm talking about Indus now. In the Indus Water Treaty, finally we signed some kind of treaty in September, that was 19 September in Karachi, 1960. It was 10 years period given to Pakistan for construction of 2 large dams, 5 barrages, 8 link canals to divert the water of western rivers into the eastern rivers. And this is the Indus Treaty. You know it better. Now this is the Indus. These are, all the tributaries. These are all the tributaries that goes into the Indus. These are all tributaries. They finally, go into the Indus like this. And, this Jhelum and all, this finally, comes into the main course of Indus like this. Jhelum, Chenab and all. This is how the things are. Now coming to the main history, how the clumsiness that made all the wisdom completely go out of the scene. In 1986, Pakistan took the case of the Vular Barrage that was in the Indus Water Commission, but the commission failed to resolve this issue. So what I mean to say, sharing of water was decided by the British government and king of, or the ruler of Kashmir those days. Then subsequently there was some kind of agreement that Pakistan will be constructing so and so dams, so and so barrages, so and so link canals and all. They could not complete in time. And then finally India started Vular Barrage construction. Pakistan took this issue. It could not be sorted out because the delay of Pakistan should not cause any kind of developmental delay to India. That was the fundamental of the jurisprudence that we as India put forth. Then Pakistan decided to take it to the international court. At some point of time, through negotiation, two sides, they almost reached an agreement in 1991, whereby India would keep 6.2 meter of the barrage ungated with the crest level so and so feet. However, the agreement was not signed. By raising the issue of Kishan Ganga project, because the main course of the Indus has so many tributaries. So on any of the tributary, Pakistan was denying any kind of development to be done by India. And India said that if we don't harness any kind of water in the upstream tributaries, then what is the meaning of, entering into a treaty with Pakistan? Pakistan was given a specific set of dams, barrages, link canals, and the water quantum as well. Now that India is exercising its privileges to develop its own water resources, how can Pakistan stop? And the infighting prolonged quite a long, even in 2012, a round of bilateral talks went on for the Tulbul navigation project and even the or the Vular Barrage project. Pakistan kept on raising one after another issues. Finally, they raised the issue of the Baglihar Dam on the Chenab. Indus Water Commission in 2015 again met. Pakistan claimed that any of the development by India on the upstream tributary would be obstructing their prospects. India's stand was very clear that whatever has been given to the Pakistan is unable to be harnessed and we are not making any encroachment on already allotted to Pakistan kind of a quantum of water, then how our project should be stalled by Pakistan? World Bank finally appointed a neutral expert, and these neutral expert that sorted out some of the crucial issues, but still all of the solutions were not acceptable to Pakistan. Pakistan objected in that report that reducing the crest elevation of the dam, that is which dam? The crest level that was earlier divided for the ungated structure. That was again a bone of contention made by Pakistan. So what I mean to say, in case the stakeholding states are all not wise, and even if a single state or a nation is a wild ball player, then you cannot harness the benefits of the water. This is the fundamental principle. So either you become all wise or all you become mad. In between, there is no solution. When all are mads, obviously fight is the outcome. When all are wise, exchange of the greeting and exchange of the benefits is the solution. So this is how the history has taught us about sharing of the water. And I'm thanking everybody for patiently hearing me. And in the final slide, I want to drive home one fundamental point of the social behavioral science, that when so many people meet together and they exchange their views, then something innovative comes out. And that's why, in our Vedas, what we say, Sangachadvam Samvadadvam Samo Manansi Janutam. So that is collaboration and cooperation to supersede the animal instinct of the feudal times of the human development. That is what we have learned today through this first session. And now I think I should open this session for the questionnaire. We have devoted some half an hour for the questionnaire. So I shall now, go to the check box. And now I am not sharing the screen. I'm coming out of this. So shall I read the chat box?
From Mr. Wasim, he's asking, what are the major factors, areas, guidelines in the order of priority, if any, which guide the philosophy behind the principle of equitable apportionment as agreed in various international customary laws?
Yes, the United Nations 1997 conventions, what you can say, they are not the enactments, but they are the agreements. They are the source material for this. And then there is one document called the Berlin Law. That is in the amendment of the 1997 agreements. That is, the basic document as a guideline for the principle of equitable apportionment to be followed in practice. Though it is a customary law, but it has nicely been interwoven into these two understandings. The next question, to what extent principles of international water law has been followed under Indus Water Treaty? In the Indus Water Treaty, the principle of equitable apportionment has been very nicely followed. Actually, in the execution of the practice, that the issues came on the way. Otherwise, Indus Water Treaty in principle is very mature kind of a treaty, and very nicely it has been founded on the principle of equitable apportionment. So it is the execution related issue. As I told you, Pakistan has been hampering the way of Indian development all the time. And that's why the execution related issue. Otherwise, the treaty, I don't think there is any kind of bug into. Another question has popped up, that is, but meaning of equitable and reasonable is very dynamic, and treaty was started in 1960 and no change in any of its provision. Yes, we need to review the treaty, but so long as the context of 1960 were concerned, the treaty was impeccable. I do agree with your question that I think it is a silent suggestion that now a review is a need of hour. I do agree with it that it was in the context of 1960. Now we need to review the treaty. It is a need of the hour. It is very dynamic, yes, but dynamism is the way to development. And in the treaty, there are certain rooms which permit you some kind of further agreements and further development of the water resources within the Indus Basin. So we need to review. I do agree.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions, please? Okay, friends, any more questions? If no questions, then can we stop here? Okay, thank you, sir.
So nice of you.
Yes, on behalf of National, I'm giving sincere thanks to sir. Okay, thank you.
So nice of you to everybody. Thank you so much.
Okay, friends, there is a small announcement. Now, next 7 webinar session will be held on 23rd November 2020. The topic is interstate river water disputes in India, challenges, Godavari water dispute, a case study. This session will be covered by Shri Chandrasekhar Iyer. Now he is chairman Godavari River Management Board, Hyderabad. Okay, friends, we will meet on 23rd. The same link will be shared with you on one day before. That is on Friday. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day.